Hello, everyone. GM. Who's new to the Ethereum space? Does everyone know what GM means? All right, a few hands, just a pulse check to get us started. Speaking of getting started, if you followed any of my work, you know that I believe that it's all coordination, and Ethereum is the ultimate coordination machine. And since it's all coordination, and it always has been, Ethereum is going to have a lot of positive effects on the world. And I want to invite you to start off ETH Austin by doing a coordination experiment with me. Are you ready? Developers, developers, developers! Thank you. Wow. You're still coordinating. It's blowing my mind. It's all coordination, and it always has been. I'm Kevin Owocki. I founded Gitcoin, which is a place that you can get coins if you're working on public goods. Public goods, things like open source software that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, that are good for the world. And we help developers get coins for working on those public goods. So I'm a big believer that crypto can regenerate the world. I wrote this book about how crypto can regenerate the world, and it's our task at Gitcoin to give you opportunities to get coins for regenerating the world. My talk today is entitled Ether's Phoenix. I want to thank Hinzu and Dystopia Labs because I rugged them and just gave them this talk this morning, even though they told me that I couldn't change my talk. But this is an idea that has been like a mind virus for me since Carl Flourish, the founder of Optimism, told me about it a couple weeks ago, and I just couldn't help but try to get it out into the world. So I think about the resources that we all rely on in order to live our lives: energy, food, transportation, housing, as sort of the foundation for a just society. And one of the things that I'm sort of worried about in my work centers on is this idea that these resources that we all rely on, when we overconsume them, when there's too much population growth, when we don't respect the commons, then we start to hit this ecological ceiling where you start to see things like climate change and chemical pollution and loss of biodiversity. And so that brings me to the question, as the guy who's focused on public goods, which is, how do we build a safe space for humanity in between the social foundation of the resources that we rely on and the ecological ceiling that, if we overconsume, will sort of break things? And I think that the financial system, as the way that things get routed around the economy, is kind of like the pinch point, right? If we can figure out how to create that social foundation, make sure that we all have energy, water, food, health, education, income and work, peace and justice, social equity, things like that, and not overconsume those things such that we break our ecological ceiling, that's the end game. That's why we're here. This is something called donut economics. It's an idea from some really amazing economists that have been thinking about these problems for a while. And what I'm increasingly doing is starting to think about, oh shoot, maybe donut economics is actually even a limited way of thinking about solving these problems, because there's actually 8 forms of capital. So material capital and the ecological ceiling that I talked about before with the loss of climate change and biodiversity is only one of those things. What about social capital? What about financial capital? What about living capital? What about intellectual capital? This presentation, by the way, is a form of intellectual capital, and whatever you hackers build this weekend will be a form of intellectual capital. Experiential capital, what are the vibes we're creating together at ETH Austin? Spiritual and cultural capital. And so when I think about the donut economics and what we're doing in this space, it occurs to me that our aperture is too narrow around material and financial capital. And what I want to do is expand the aperture into a rainbow of 8 forms of capital and think about, what does the donut look like if we color it to focus on intellectual capital? Underfunded public science, underfunded open source software, digital infrastructure, runaway artificial general intelligence. What if we think about the ceiling of our financial capital? Bitcoin, in the Genesis block, talked about the chancellor being on the breakout, or was that thing that's in the Satoshi's white paper that was encoded in it? It was Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Was the message in there. And so what do we think about the fragility of our financial system? The illiquidity of funding of public goods, but the liquidity of funding massive hedge funds, things that are massively sucking value out of society. As opposed to material forms of capital where you overconsume them, these types of financial capital actually suffers from underinvestment in public goods. So we hit our ecological ceiling by not investing in things, which I think is counterintuitive, but it's still a ceiling that we're hitting. Anyway, there are 8 forms of capital, so I believe there are 8 donuts, and it is my proposal to expand the donut out into these 8 different forms of the ecological ceiling. And so as we start to build a 3-dimensional donut by complexing out from 1 form of capital to 2 forms of capital to 3 forms of capital to 4 forms of capital to 8 forms of capital, we actually start to think about the ceiling of all the different forms of capital that our social foundations that we started with, energy networks, food, transportation, housing, all rely on. And we start to see the strain that they're under with exponential population growth and the things that come along with it as we increasingly become a digital society. An increase in ransomware attacks is actually growth in financial capital, and it's pushing strain on the system. A growth in information coordination failures like misinformation that are putting strain on the system. A growth in material capital that is putting strain on our atmosphere. Summit after summit, we are unable to coordinate in order to solve the ecological ceiling. And so I think as we hit the ecological ceiling more and more often and at an increasingly fast pace, it has never been more important to coordinate in order to fund public goods. The things that we all rely on are increasingly hitting their ceilings. And I think that what I'm really excited about to give this talk today is this idea called Ethers Phoenix, which comes from Carl Flourish, that says that Ethereum is all about building systems that create mass coordination. We've got massive coordination failure as a society, and we've got a coordination machine that is programmable, global, has $2 trillion worth of capital in it, and is totally transparent, which means that we have the same access to it as the bankers, and it's immutable, which means that they don't have root access over everyone else. The most fundamental coordination problem that we're trying to solve in the Ethereum space is the tragedy of the commons, aka the free rider problem, aka the prisoner's dilemma. What are those things? The free rider problem basically says, I get open source software for free. I get fresh air for free. Why the fuck would I even give back and contribute to it? It's a narrow view that focuses on only what's good for you now. What if we were to expand our aperture away from free riding on public goods into what's good for now us and into future us? The tragedy of the commons basically is the social version of the individual free rider problem, which basically says if all of us don't contribute to the commons, to open source software, to climate change, and to the fixing the loss of biodiversity, then basically what happens is that those systems collapse. And what if we were to take the tragedy of the commons and invest in the commons and to invest in public goods? What kind of society would that create? And would it prevent us from hitting those ecological ceilings? The prisoner's dilemma is a way of complexing out what I do to what you do. If I decide to coordinate and to invest in public goods, are you going to free ride? Are you going to defect and not contribute to public goods? The prisoner's dilemma is a thought experiment in which 2 prisoners are captured for doing a crime, and the police separate them. And for lack of a way of coordinating between those 2 prisoners, they will always defect on each other. They will always rat on each other. But if they had a way of coordinating, they could get lesser sentences for themselves and for their partners by both staying silent. Many games in society are coordination games, and the problem is that without a coordination mechanism, we will always defect from those games. And what's great for us is that Ethereum is here, and we have a coordination machine. In these games, you have 2 choices. You can either defect or coordinate. Defecting maximizes your short-term payouts, and cooperation maximizes your long-term payouts. What would it look like if we were to stack our incentives on top of each other and to realize that if we all coordinate, then we will actually achieve more for humanity? So this is an idea from Carl about Ethers Phoenix, which basically says that we are living in a world in which everyone is defecting and cooperation is in scarce supply. our industrial age institutions are not able to solve these coordination problems. How can we keep the faith and cooperate in a world full of defectors? Well, I've got an answer for you. And I think that it's a good answer because I think the stakes are fucking high as shit. Because the ecological foundation is the outward pushing on our social things that we rely on, like energy, food, water, health, and education networks. And I think that the answer is Ethers Phoenix, which hopefully puts a little bit of faith in your life, because I know that I need faith in order to coordinate. So basically the idea is, if you picture a world in which the future is that public goods are being rewarded in proportion to their impact, which is basically the fairness ratio. It says that if you contribute to the supporting biodiversity or preventing climate change or supporting open source software, then you will be rewarded in proportion to your impact. The fairness ratio says public goods are good. If you give to public goods, then you'll get rewarded. And this is actually what Optimism is working on, is this idea of retroactive public goods funding. Optimism has $3 million a month that they're giving out to people who are supporting public goods. So this isn't just a theory. This is something that Optimism is working on in order to create this optimistic future. And Carl calls this idea Ethers Phoenix. So basically, one of the things that deserves retroactive public goods, which is just paying people for the public goods that they create, is not just future public goods, but it's the early contributors that made that reality possible. So Ethers Phoenix will look backwards and reward early cooperators and contributors to public goods retroactively through retroactive public goods funding, using that $3 million a month that Optimism has, and probably complexing into all of the different public goods that come from Gitcoin and Pinvala and CLR Fund and all of these other public goods funding mechanisms. And what we're looking for, by the way, is to bootstrap coordination. So stop defecting and to start coordinating. And Ethers Phoenix is the mechanism through which that happens. So if you think about it, it's kind of like an angel that rewards you for summoning it. And there's this thought experiment by this famous philosopher called Rocco's Basilisk, which is an evil AI that punishes you if you don't summon it. So basically, you've got a negative version of this, which is a demon that punishes you if you don't summon it. And then you've got Ethers Phoenix, which is a angel that rewards you if you do summon it. And how do we know that it's a good egregore? An egregore is basically like a common shared manifestation of human thought. Well, you know that it's good because it's focused on public goods. The fairness ratio is what is basically rewarding you for summoning it. So basically, Ethers Phoenix rewards your early investment to public goods. And I think that what's really neat about this idea of Ethers Phoenix, and one of the reasons why I wanted to give this talk today, is because we are summoning Ethers Phoenix in the Ethereum space by building coordination on top of this global substrate for Ethereum and for human coordination. And maybe like we're summoning it and it's giving us back this lore and reward. But I think that it's summoning us in order to support public good, which I think is a really interesting sort of like dance that we're doing in this space. And in the middle, by the way, is this donut economy, which is all the public goods that we rely on. So I guess what I'll end by saying is, let's build public goods because public goods are good. Let's start a retroactive public goods revolution. Let's build a more solar punk world, a world in which we're focused on the sustainability of the planet, of our capital systems. Let's go to the quadratic lands, a world in which we've rewritten the laws of the financial system in order to favor coordination and defecting over defection. And let's pass the great filter. If you think about it from the point of view of humanity, if you scope out from now me all the way to now us, why wouldn't we want to go from multicellular life to civilization to a planetary scale species? What's the counter argument against that? Ethers Phoenix is our public goods, and we can decide that we want to coordinate in order to summon these public goods to solve these problems. All we have to do is coordinate. If you want to watch the episode of Green Pill Podcast, which is about Ethers Phoenix, then you can get it at this QR code. And thank you. Let's support our public goods.